My nudes accidentally got sent to his cousin. He printed them as holiday cards for my family. Hello, Redditors. This is my first post here, and sadly, it's because I need some advice. I did something really horrible, and I don't know how to bounce back from it because it has ruined everything in my life. I don't know what to do and how to get back from it. My name is Megan, and I'm 33 years old. I've been married for 14 years now, and I have a son, Jonathan. He's 13 years old. My husband's name is Smith, and he's a computer technologist. He owns his own company, and we are very much comfortable. I mean, very well above average. I do not work, though. Smith and I had planned after our wedding that I was going to be a stay-at-home wife and mother, so I could tend to our son. I made a mistake. No, I committed a huge sin against everything that I know and believe in, and I'm terribly sorry. But Smith wouldn't even listen to me or forgive me, and he has done a horrible thing as revenge. Actually, it's entirely my fault. Well, don't judge me. Let me explain how it all happened. Like I said before, Smith and I got married very early. At first, things weren't so easy because we got married so early due to a mistake, although my son is the best mistake of my life, so our family had been very furious with us at first and had abandoned us to fend for ourselves and realize our mistakes. We did realize our mistakes, but we were so in love with each other and were ready to go through the hurdle together. I got pregnant at 19, and Smith was 5 years older than me, so he was already done with college while I was just starting. We got married, but none of our families were there to witness it because they thought we were being foolish. Smith worked twice as hard to fend for me and the baby while I went to school. We stayed together in our very small apartment. He went to work while I went to school, all while being pregnant. I won't talk about the eyes, the whispers, and the stigmatization, but I barely had any friends in those early years. But after I gave birth to Jonathan, our family wanted to be back in our lives. They even offered to take the baby off our hands while we focused on building our lives. But Smith and I refused. We wanted to be there for our baby and support him, not abandon him like they did us at first. Our family eventually agreed, but tried to sponsor my education and find a better paying job for Smith. But one thing about my husband is that he's a very proud man. Smith refused any sort of help from both his family and mine. He wanted to do everything on his own, including sending me to school. According to him, I was his responsibility, and he didn't shy away from responsibilities. He kept to his word and paid for everything throughout my college days. The only thing we relied on our parents for was babysitting Jonathan whenever I was stuck with schoolwork and Smith with jobs. By the time I was done with college, Smith had started building his company. He was very good, and due to people knowing him from his numerous part-time jobs, he had a lot of customers and even investors investing in him. Within 2 years of starting up his business, Smith was well known in the technology world, and he was making massive success. We were happy, everything was working well for us, and we were happy. Although Smith and I agreed that I would be a housewife, it got tiring after a while, and I decided to start working. Smith, being a supportive husband, supported my decision and even helped me get a job as a secretary. But within 4 months of working there, I was tired, and I quit. Thinking it was because the boss was quite demanding, I got another job at a different company, where I got to laze around as much as I wanted, but I still wasn't pleased. So I realized that being a working wife and mother just wasn't what I wanted. So I quit working totally and just focused on what made me really happy, my husband and my son. We did try for another baby for years, but we couldn't get pregnant. When we visited the hospital, I discovered that my fallopian tube was somehow twisted after the birth of Jonathan, and that I couldn't have a baby anymore unless a miracle happened. I cannot explain the medical terms. Smith was the one who listened to the doctor. The only thing I really heard was the fact that I couldn't get pregnant again. It was a hard pill for me to swallow, and I was so sad, but Smith was very supportive. He helped me get through it and over it. I focused all my attention on my baby boy because he's apparently the only child I could have. But over the years, I cannot exactly say when things started to change for me, when I started to feel like family life wasn't for me. I started to envy the freedom that my friends had to sleep with any and every man that came their way. Maybe it was because Smith was the only man I ever knew, and he was the one who slept with me first. Maybe it was because I didn't get to experience breakups and heartbreaks from having another relationship before entering directly into marriage. I don't know if it was all that caused the way I was feeling, but I just knew that I felt like I needed to be free and experiment. I wanted to desperately know what it felt like to be lusted after and looked at like I was the sexiest woman in the world, and that the person lusting after me couldn't wait to get me in bed and fuck the life out of me. I wanted to do a lot of things, but I just couldn't, and that frustrated me. To be honest, I was the only one feeling like that. Smith was comfortable with our marriage. He loved being married to me. He loved that we got married earlier than usual, and he loved that we got to spend our youth together. He loved coming home to me and smelling the nice scents coming from my pots. He loved each of our anniversaries. He loved how surprised people always were to find out how many years we've been together. And he loved our son very, very much, and honestly, I did too. I loved all of those things, and I loved Smith too. But I cannot tell when all of those things I appreciated and loved just stopped being enough. Maybe I should have talked to Smith about how I was feeling, or perhaps seen a therapist. Or we could have gone to see a therapist together so we could work out why I was feeling that way. But I didn't. I felt like a bitch for not being grateful for all the things I had that my friends were really envious of. I felt like if I said it out loud, I would sound like a selfish woman who wanted to just cheat on her husband. So I kept all of those feelings in and continued to pretend like I was okay and that it was just a phase that was going to pass over soon. But it wasn't. It wasn't just a phase. It was me. It was how I felt for over 3 years. The crazy thing was that Smith never suspected a thing. He didn't suspect that I was unhappy and that I somehow wanted to just have sex with another man and see whether or not I'd feel the same way I felt with him. Maybe it was because I was so good at playing the happy housewife and mother. Maybe it's because anytime he bought me a gift, I pretended like it was the most perfect gift with tears in my eyes. Maybe it's because every time he took me out to dinner or surprised me with a trip, I pretended like I had everything I ever wanted with him. Maybe I was just a very good liar and pretender. And for a while, I was okay with pretending like everything was fine so long as I had Smith and Jonathan. I was happy to pretend because their happiness was enough to make me go extra miles. But that was when Joe came into the picture. Despite being married to Smith for the longest time, I had no idea who Joe was until he came around claiming to be their distant cousin from their paternal grandfather. He was seeking refuge because, according to him, he lost his family, a wife and 3 kids, in a tragic accident, and he was the only survivor. He just couldn't stay alone. Apparently, none of his other family were in contact with him anymore because they believed that he must have had something to do with the accident since he survived alone. So he had no choice but to seek another part of his family so he could at least be with family. Smith's mother didn't believe him and hence did not offer him any form of settlement, but Smith, being Smith, decided to take him in after asking me, though, and I accepted. That was how Joe started living with us. He didn't live inside the main house, though. He stayed at the small house we had built in case anyone had to stay with us, but so it wouldn't be inconvenient if anyone was in our space. It was inside our compound and linked to the house, so I could still call it living with us. I made sure that whenever I cooked, I made his with ours, and since he always refused to come into the house to eat, I usually brought it to him so he could eat. On some days I would sit with him, and I thought I was doing him a favor so he could stop thinking about the loss of his family. We would sit inside his room for hours and talk and joke about anything and everything after Smith had gone to work and Jonathan to school. He kept me company around the house. He even started coming into the main house to sit with me while I did some cleaning. He never came around when Smith was around, though, and stupidly, I never questioned that. I just felt it was because he was more comfortable around me, and because I was the only person in the family who offered a hand of friendship towards him. Our talk started to broaden from general things to more personal things, and I found myself telling him about things I wouldn't even generally accept to myself, things I would never tell Smith about. I told him how I was feeling being married, and early at that. I told him about wanting to have sex with another man, and I told him about how unhappy I was. From then on, our conversation shifted, and we started flirting. It was subtle at first, and it was always almost like I imagined it, but then later, it became very evident. He would wink at me, or sometimes just draw me near himself and peck my cheeks. Sometimes he would nearly kiss me, and then withdraw like he was about to do something he knew he couldn't be doing. One time, he had his hand on my breasts, and although I didn't say anything, he withdrew his hand like he touched a hot surface and went back to his room, not showing up for the rest of the day. The next day, after Smith and Jonathan had gone to work and school respectively, I went in search of Joe, and I got the shock of my life. Now that I think about it as I write, I realize that it was actually intentional. He had done it so I could see. He wasn't hiding it like he pretended to. He did it purposely. I met Joe on his couch in his living room. His door, which was usually closed, was left ajar like he had mistakenly forgotten to close it. He wasn't just on his couch. His trousers were on the ground, and he was touching himself. On his TV, porn was showing, and he was grunting really loudly. I left quickly like I hadn't been there, but what I saw bothered me a lot. I was so horny and hot. And I waited for Smith to come back home that evening to relieve myself. But Smith had not only shown up late, but was exhausted, and he was so sleepy he barely touched his meal. So there I was, lying in bed with my husband, who was snoring really loudly, and I was thinking about another man. I was imagining his hands touching me the way he had touched himself, and I was imagining all the dirty things he could do to me. I did what I had never done since I knew what sex was. I touched myself. I had never done it before because I had never been curious about it, and Smith had always done these things for me, so I had never had to do them myself. But seeing Joe that day touch himself and have that much pleasure, I wanted to see what it was like. I was disappointed, though, in the end. I didn't understand how to do it properly, so I gave up eventually. The next day, curiously, I asked Joe how touching oneself felt. He was surprised I asked, but he said he couldn't describe it, but could show me if I wanted to learn. I know I shouldn't have. I should have just said, never mind, I'd rather not, and then walked back into the house. But I just stood there and nodded my head like a child asked if she wanted candy. Joe led me towards the only sofa in his room, and he removed my clothes slowly and deliberately. He then stood there and asked me to do everything he said. I should have felt shy being naked in front of my husband's cousin, but instead I sat there like an obedient little sheep. He asked me to touch my breasts, and I did hesitantly, but he insisted I rub them like I was imagining someone doing it for me. I closed my eyes and did as he asked, and I started to feel pleased. The person I was imagining rubbing my breasts wasn't Smith. It wasn't my husband. It was him. Joe. I was imagining him touching me, and I was just feeling so much pleasure from rubbing my own breasts. Then he asked me to touch myself down there. I did as asked, and I was starting to moan out loudly when I felt, before I saw, his hand removing mine from my vulva and replacing it with his. When I opened my eyes, he was also naked, and he was touching me while staring at me without breaking eye contact. It was erotic, and I had an orgasm right there. He didn't stop there, though. He turned me against the sofa and slid into me. I didn't complain, I didn't shout, or say it was wrong. I just moaned, feeling so much pleasure. I ended up having an orgasm twice while he was inside me. In my heightened state of pleasure, I forgot we didn't even use protection. But then, remembering that I couldn't even get pregnant, I dismissed the thought. Joe wasn't done with me, though. We had sex about 3 times more that day, and each time was much more erotic than the last one. At the end of it all, my vulva was hot and hurting, perhaps because of the intensity of the sex we had. I went back to the house to take a shower and also cook before Jonathan and Smith arrived. It was then the guilt hit. I felt really bad. I had just cheated on my husband with his cousin, and I didn't even do it once. I did it 4 different times. Once would have been considered a mistake, but 4 times in a row definitely wasn't. And I didn't know if I could face my husband and smile like I usually do without slipping up about everything I did. But I did. I stood in front of the door and hugged my son and kissed my husband welcome. I served their food after they had their shower, and I smiled when they paid me compliments about the food. I even allowed Smith to touch me that night. I slept with my husband the night of the day I first cheated on him. I was sensitive down there, but I pretended like it was just some hormonal changes instead of what had gone down between Joe and me. And Smith believed me. Of course he did. We've been together for years and we loved each other. Smith didn't suspect a thing that day. For about 2 days, I avoided Joe, which was quite difficult given we lived in the same house. He came in search of me after the 2 days and asked why I was avoiding him. I told him the truth. It was because I felt guilty and also lucky that my husband didn't suspect a thing, and I didn't want to create any chances of that happening. He asked me if that was the only thing that bothered me, and I said yes. He said he knew my husband didn't suspect, and that I didn't tell him because he expected a knock on his door and a punch afterward, but nothing of that sort had happened. He surprisingly apologized for luring me into doing something I was not happy doing, and promised that he wouldn't try it again. Then he left. For about a week, Joe and I didn't say much to each other. I only gave him his food, and he'd reply with a thanks, and that was all the conversation we had throughout the day. I was supposed to be happy, I cheated, and I was not caught, and I got to live my life the way it had always been. But I wasn't happy. I felt like I wanted more, and it was hard looking at Joe whenever he worked in the garden at the back of the house shirtless without getting turned on. I tried touching myself several times, imagining Joe's hands, but it still didn't give me the feeling of that day, and I was just sexually frustrated. I went online and used an anonymous name to ask some questions on a particular site I came across that dealt with marriages and their problems, and several people had called me crazy and all sorts. But there was a particular comment that said I should probably try a different man, a stranger preferably, and see whether or not I'd still feel that way. I took the advice. On a night when Smith had gone out of town for work and Jonathan had gone for a sleepover at his best friend's house, I was home alone. Even Joe had gone out of town for that day. I was just alone and sexually frustrated, so I had worn a wig that I bought off the street at a cheap price. I wore a very slutty dress that barely covered my butt, and I had gone out to a club. I got attention quite all right, but none of them intrigued me enough to want to experiment with. When I had given up and was about to leave, I bumped into this very tall man who made me feel like a dwarf. And I'm taller than most average women, for you to know how tall he was. The spark was instant, and when he offered to take me out of there, I didn't hesitate. He checked into a nearby motel, and we went up into the room we were allocated. No words were needed between us. We went straight into business. He made me go down on him to give him pleasure down there, and since I had never done it before, I might have left a few bite marks on him. He didn't mind, though, and he just ripped my panties and my thin leggings, used protection, and slid into me. It was very quick, and within 2 hours we were done with it. It was quite disappointing, especially after Joe's experience, which lasted for hours. I picked up my torn clothes, borrowed a robe from the bathroom, and just left, and that was it. No names exchanged, no information needed. We needed each other at that point. We got what we both wanted, and that was that. He probably didn't even know I had too much makeup on to change my looks, and that my hair was fake. When Joe came back the next day, I went straight to him, removed my underwear right in front of him, and just lay in his bed with my legs wide open. He didn't need any further invitations, as he hurriedly removed his clothes and climbed into bed with me. It was not as disappointing as that of the stranger. It was good, and from that day, we started having sex nearly every day. After Smith had left for work and Jonathan to school, I would go over to Joe's room, and we would indulge in different acts. Sometimes he came over to the main house, and we violated nearly every room in the house except my matrimonial bed and my son's room. I felt like having sex with another man in those 2 rooms just cemented my fate as an adulteress. Even though I already was an adulteress, I just felt like I would be insulting Smith and the vows of our wedding if I did have sex with another man on our matrimonial bed. We did it everywhere else, though. On the sofa, the bathroom, the kitchen, and even the balcony. The kitchen was our favorite place, though. Joe would pick me up and lay me on the kitchen aisle, and he would plunge into me, or when he would place my hands against the kitchen aisle and pummel into me from behind. There were times when the ingredients for cooking had turned into sex toys. My syrup had been poured on my chest once and licked right after. I even had a spatula stuck up my vulva one time. We did everything in the book and out. But one day, everything changed when Joe brought home a girl and introduced her as his girlfriend. I wasn't happy, I was very angry, and I waited till I got him alone to lash out, and he dismissed my anger as nothing. I couldn't do much. I was married. He was just cheating with me, and it wasn't like I had any right to be angry. Joe seemed to like the lady very much, and he was always spending time with her, which meant less time with me, leaving me all sexually frustrated and insulted. I stopped cooking for him and also visiting him, but Joe didn't mind. One time I had tried to lure him into the house for quick sex while the girl was around in his room, so I had called him on the phone and told him that I had an issue with my bathroom and water was flooding everywhere. When Joe came, I was already on the bed naked. He realized what I was doing, and he was angry. I was able to pacify him, and he, in turn, did as I begged him to. He had sex with me, but it happened so fast, and then it was over. He didn't even have an orgasm. Once he saw that I already had one, he stopped, wore his clothes, and left. I was beyond shocked. Joe would usually sleep with me until I had 2 to 3 orgasms before we stopped, but it was so different this time. I felt angry and jealous, and I just hated the girl. I started to complain about her to Smith, telling him that I felt Joe wasn't mentally stable enough to manage another relationship after the loss of his family, and that I felt the lady was just using him, taking advantage of his vulnerability. Smith didn't see things that way, though. He felt Joe was mature enough to know what he was feeling. It pissed me off knowing that Smith felt like that about the whole situation, and I knew I had to just take matters into my hands. Smith suggested that Joe start following him to the office and working so he wouldn't have to sit at home. So Smith and Joe started going everywhere together, making it almost impossible to even see Joe at all. I was happy yet at the same time sad, because it meant he got to see the girl less, but it also meant he didn't have time for me too. He got back at the same time as Smith, so there was almost no time for me as he paid attention to the lady once he was back. I wanted to destroy their relationship so badly, and I focused all my attention on that, forgetting that I was a married woman who should be focused on her family, not another person. That day, I got a stupid idea, and I decided it was the perfect idea. I was indoors all day, so I thought Joe didn't go out, and knowing that the girl was also around in his room, I decided to do something really stupid. Smith had told me that he wanted to go on a trip, but he wouldn't take Joe along with him, so I thought my plans had no loopholes. I took several pictures of myself naked and touching myself and sent them to Joe, hoping that somehow the girl would see them, get angry, and call it quits with Joe. But what happened was worse. Smith arrived at the house early that afternoon, and I was so surprised, especially when I saw the look on his face. He came in with Joe behind him, but there was something strange. Joe had a black eye, and he was keeping a safe distance between my husband and himself. I looked between them, confused, and then Smith shoved the phone in my face. It was Joe's phone, and it was the picture I took that morning, naked. I was so shocked, and I tried to cover everything by lying. I said it was actually Smith I wanted to send it to and that it was a mistake, but Smith didn't believe me because apparently Joe had confessed everything. I tried begging for forgiveness, but Smith wouldn't listen to me. He ordered Joe out of his house, but he wouldn't say anything to me. I would have preferred the anger and maybe even violence to the silence that followed after Smith found out about Joe and me. It was deafening and scary, and even Jonathan noticed. When he asked, I couldn't tell him what I had done to destroy our family. We usually go over to my parents' place for Christmas, and then Smith's parents' place for New Year. It was a yearly tradition, and this time it was no different. It was Christmas, and we traveled to my parents' place. Only this time, things were very much different. All through the ride, Smith didn't even spare me a glance, and the only reaction I got out of him was the way he clutched the wheel tightly. Other than that, nothing. We got to my parents' place on the eve of Christmas, and we just ate and slept. The next morning, everyone moved downstairs to give their gifts, and Smith announced that he wanted to give us his gifts first. My parents and siblings were excited. Instead of a box wrapped as usual, it was a card wrapped with a simple ribbon. But everyone was still excited, thinking it was perhaps a ticket to a luxurious place or something. But when they opened it, they looked at me and were all so shocked. I was surprised, wondering what the matter was, until I collected the card from my sister and saw what was in it. They were my nude pictures, the ones I sent to Joe. Smith had printed them out and handed them to my family to see my shame. I just started crying, and Smith went on to explain everything that happened. My mom looked at me in disgust and asked me to get out, and even said she never wanted to see me again. My siblings were no different. They all looked at me like I was some piece of garbage. I left my parents' house feeling so ashamed and disgusted with myself and regretting why I decided to ruin my perfect life. But Smith wasn't done with me yet. He came home that evening but without Jonathan, and he handed me my own gift. It was divorce papers and a custody lawsuit. He wanted to destroy me totally. It's not even his fault. I destroyed us in the first place by cheating. But I cannot sign the divorce papers. I cannot let go of Smith and Jonathan. They're my life, and I feel so horrible it took me this long to see that. What do I do, guys? Please help me. I'm desperate at this point. Update. Hello, Reddit. It's a new year, and everybody else is feeling merry, gifting their loved ones and appreciating the fact that they get to spend another year together. Everyone else is happy, but I'm not. I'm sad. Very sad, in fact. As soon as the clock rang and it was midnight, I could hear people shouting and wishing each other a happy new year. I was in my room feeling more miserable, because I couldn't spend the new year with the people I love most in the world. Because I ruined the chance to kiss my son on the forehead and wish him a happy birthday and a happy new year. Because I ruined the chance of kissing my husband and thanking him for giving me a son that perfect. I ruined everything. I was greedy and selfish and stupid, and I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I cheated. I cheated on the most perfect man. I cheated on my only chance of happiness, and now I'm so miserable and unhappy. I should have never been unsatisfied in the first place. I should have been grateful for my family, for my husband who stayed right from the beginning and didn't falter in his love for me. I should have been grateful to have a son like Jonathan and just tried to work out my insecurities and feelings by talking to my husband or even meeting a therapist. I should have worked hard at keeping my marriage and family secure instead of going ahead and ruining everything. I should have. Now I'm stuck here in this tiny apartment because Smith not only wanted a divorce but also kicked me out of the house, wishing I had done the things I didn't do to make my marriage work. I feel like a failure. No, scratch that, I am a failure. I failed at the only thing I should have been best at. I failed at being a mother and a wife, and I feel so horrible. Horrible will probably be an understatement to how I feel right at this moment. I should have done better. I just went ahead and cheated, not just once, but several times. I insulted my husband and the vows of our marriage just to satisfy my own greedy nature. I was foolish. And the most painful thing is I only see how foolish I was now that I've lost everything. There's nothing left for me anymore. I've lost the only thing I've built since I became an adult, my family. There's nothing else to do. I've only ever known to do that. Now I step into my tiny kitchen and find myself cooking for 3 people instead of 1. I find myself waking up and subconsciously going in search of my son's room to wake him up with a kiss on his forehead so he could get ready for school. I keep forgetting that there's only 1 room in the apartment I stay in now, so I still end up wandering back into the same room, and then realizing what had just happened. I would cry so hard on my bed. I should have known that I would lose the people that mattered the most to me if I cheated. I wouldn't have done it. Now I'm so lonely. Nobody wants to talk to me. Somehow the news had circulated our friend circle, and now everyone has found an excuse or a reason to stay away from me. I stay awake most nights, staring at my phone and waiting for a phone call. Perhaps just one person will call me and ask whether or not I'm okay, or if I am coping. There's no one. I'm all alone. My husband doesn't want me anymore. My son probably hates me now, and my family and friends all think I'm disgusting. Even Smith's mother, who used to think so highly of me and adored me like I was her own child, doesn't even speak to me anymore. She's probably disgusted with me, as is everyone else. It's so hard living like this. I feel so frustrated and annoyed with myself, and on most days I can't even breathe. Is there a way to endure this pain? Will it fade with time or not? Update. Hello, Reddit. This is probably my last post here. You know how people say wounds get healed with time? Well, it's a lie, and I'm living proof of that. It's been well over 3 months, and you'd expect that I would be able to move on with life, or might have felt better. But no. I feel more awful as time passes by, and I didn't even think it was possible until now. The more time passes, the more it dawns on me that I can never be a part of the family I once was. The more time passes, the more I realize that my son will grow away from me and end up hating me because of what I've done, if he already doesn't. I wish I could really turn back the hands of time and fix what I broke. Smith doesn't want me anywhere near them, and he made it clear to my family that any contact with me meant losing any contact with their grandson, nephew. So now, I'm stuck at the bottom of this hellhole I created for myself, and I can't seem to get out. I ruined my life with my own hands, and I will never stop regretting or feeling terrible about it. Funny, it wasn't even because of money that I did it. Others at least have the excuse of money, but I don't. I was comfortable and happy, but then I chose not to be, and in the end, I've ended up in the worst way possible. I wish you guys would learn from my mistakes and not make them, regardless of how much you seem to detest me from your words and actions. Thanks and goodbye.